Hajime!
Salvete Legionaries. And so I have returned again with the second course, or rather the second installment of Caesar Imperator, as we progress through the civil wars of Caesar's compendium of victories, of his destiny, traced out by the fates. And because this is a linear chronological event, I highly recommend that you go back to the first and you listen all the way through. Otherwise the context will be missing, because each installation of the series builds on the prior one. There will be references and there will be kind of circuitous remarks that are alluding to previously made instructions, or kind of in the future I'll actually have some modern allusions to modern paradigms, so that way you're able to understand Legionary, the present solutions, or rather the present phenomena as they exist in our time, comparative to, of course, this archaic or one found in antiquity, the ideas of the past, or rather the events of the past. And so, I mean, the reason why I'm doing this, and like I said again, I say this multiple times, but the purpose behind this is to make you understand that though warfare changes, right, exactly how warfare actually is waged. So, for instance, back in the olden days, you had a sword and a shield and legions, and today we have rifles, advanced communication systems, avionics, all kinds of crazy stuff going on. War is a perennial phenomenon, and so the purpose is about elucidating war itself, the things that have universal truth, the things in which we're able to leverage forever. Because if I were to talk about, just as any other mill blogger account here on the internets, what would happen is effectively you would find that a lot of the commentary would be out of date. And so to make yourself timeless, to make yourself a resource for all times, it's important to talk about things from a perennial or universal truth perspective. So, anyway, therefore, Legionaries, let's transport ourselves back to the fertile valleys of the Italian peninsula. And here, Caesar is hearing stories emanating from the Roman Republic, specifically from Rome and the Senate itself. The Senate, in a hostile way, has realized or made its first move, and in a very partisan state capture maneuver, they exiled all the representatives of the Caesarian faction and start ramming through a number of propositions through the Senate. And I want to read from the source itself, just so that way you can understand exactly in which words Caesar is relaying the course of events in which are important to us. So I'm reading from Caesar now, the Civil War. The Senate was dismissed toward the evening, and everyone who belonged to that order was then summoned out of the city by Pompey. He praised those intent on taking bold action and encouraged them for further future, while reproach those who were less eager and urging them forward. Everywhere, large numbers of Pompey's armies were called back to arms by raising the hope of material rewards and promotions, and many were brought in from the 2 legions that had been handed over by Caesar. The city and the comitium were filled with military tribunes, centurions, and re-enlisted men. All those who were motivated by friendship toward the consuls, obligations toward Pompey, and long-standing enmity toward Caesar were herded into the Senate.
Their crowding together intimidated men of weaker resolve and encouraged those who were hesitating. As a result, the majority were robbed of their ability to express their decision freely. Proposals were also made by a number of senators and to send envoys to Caesar with the charge of explaining the will of the Senate to him. So, as you can, an end quote by the way, so as you can understand, what's happening here is this hostile takeover. In other words, a kind of coup d'etat, right? It's a very soft coup d'etat. Well, I mean, I can assume that there's some measure of violence and implied violence for sure. As you can hear here, there is a certain kind of intimidation factor going on. And this intimidation factor prevents the freedom of discourse and the ability for representatives of all factions of the Republic to contend and to make their claims personally. And so the Pompeian faction, or what I would like to call the Optimates faction, right, because they represent the interests of the entrenched nobility, the entrenched deep-set nobility. And in effect, what's happening is basically the Optimates faction understands that this is the moment. This is the moment in which ultimately we can finally nip in the bud, or at least nip in the bud of this resurgent, recurring threat of the populares, right? The Caesarian faction. And to give you, of course, a recap, remember that preceding Caesar had come Marius, and preceding Marius had come the Gracchi. And all of these have a continuity as far as them representing themselves as the populist faction. It seems like a recurring issue which had been resurging for the last 150 years of their contemporaneous timeline. And this, for them, is going to be another fait accompli. This is going to be another coup de main in which they're able to gather all their supporters, take to arms, and, of course, put down this incipient, quote-unquote, tyrannical threat facing the Senate, or facing the Republic. However, before we get too deep into the rabbit hole, and trust me, I will explicate the political circumstances and dynamics as they play out, but it's important for you to understand some requisite foundational knowledge of what a republic is, or rather what a state is as such, right? And this is something I've formulated myself because I found the classical sources to not necessarily be instructive enough, because it's a very ephemeral, it's very nebulous, it's not very self-understanding, okay? Further, I think that much of modern political analysis and philosophy, or science, quote-unquote science, by the way, completely disparage anyone that calls politics a science, because we haven't managed to make it a science at all. And this presupposes the idea that there's a rational pre-understanding, self-understanding of motives, okay? This is the worst materialist understanding of humans. Humans have agency. Humans are fundamentally irrational. And this is an indictment against Adam Smith, against John Locke, against basically every idiot from the Enlightenment. So, and by the way, I have a personal beef to pick with the Enlightenment, okay? Joseph de Maistre absolutely nailed their hides to the freaking cross when he pointed out exactly who they were. But anyway, long story short, we return to this idea of the state. What is the state? What are the components of the state? The components of the state are this. 1, the body politic. 2, the ideal. And 3, the aristocracy. Now, the body politic, as I define it, are the people. But not simply any people. It's not just like in America, if you talk to normies, it's just anyone who believes in the post office or something like that. No, it's the original ethnic core component, right? It's the people who generated or gestated the original core of the state. And remember, the state is organic because the people are organic. The people that are composite of all these things are organic themselves. 2, the ideal. What is the ideal? The ideal nowadays, especially since the Enlightenment, since rationalism and so on, we conceive of it as principles. So, for instance, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or the French Republic, égalité, fraternité, whatever the crap, you know? However, in ancient times, it was a lot less explicit. And what I mean by that is it's a lot more ephemeral. So it was religious. And it wasn't as organized as the subsequent monotheistic religions that had taken place late in the Roman Empire, right? So the religions were very much so locally, traditionally passed down. They were subject to organic developments and accretions. It was almost like a sedentary situation where, you know how you had sedimentary rock in which every generation layered on top of the other and layered on top of the other. Hence, of course, the emphasis of what is truly called cognitive conservatism. Because the idea is that in conservatism, or the idea, self-understanding of conservatism, is that the body politic is a sum of its actions and experiences, but of course what it chooses to do under those circumstances, and therefore the essence of how a nation resolves, or how the events, or the psychological, the collective psychological unconsciousness chooses to resolve these things as a community. And so for the Roman religion, a lot of this was an emanation or a kind of continuation of the project of Romulus, the kings, and then later, of course, the Republic as it was formed under the Brutii. And then, of course, the gods as they're conceived of locally by the Romans, which at this time, as I say before, wasn't truly Hellenized. Hellenism at this time was only beginning to become proliferated around the aristocratic class, which is the highest echelons, and was completely removed from what the plebeians were exposed to. And by the way, during this time, it's such a golden era because it was Cicero himself who was importing much of this philosophy from the East. As a Greek speaker, he was transcribing, transliterating, and also explicating, expounding them to his friends. And he was writing, he's actually a great Stoic himself, a philosopher himself, in addition to, of course, being a statesman. Even though I disagree with Cicero, I kind of dislike his personal life in the sense of him choosing to be a lawyer as opposed to being a man of steel and sword. I can respect him for his valor and for his virtues. And just because someone might be adversarial to me, and just like any warrior will understand since the beginning of time, we're able to admire a worthy adversary. And so Cicero is that for me, but it's important for you to understand that at this time, Hellenism had not penetrated deeply into the Roman collective unconscious. And of course, their gods and much of their culture was derived from Hellenic culture, but I think it's really important you understand at this time it's still very heavily Etruscan. And of course, the Etruscans are a completely different ethnicity, cultural, even genetically different Ephyrians from Asia Minor, from the time before, and are completely unrelated to the Greeks themselves. But it really is important for you to understand this dynamic because ultimately the political philosophy that had been imported from Greece was completely different from what the Romans self-conceived themselves to have, right? And I mean, for instance, you read Cicero and his conversations, and many of these ancient philosophers, such as Cicero, would represent their views through the mouths of various different peers that they have. And so Scipio is one such figure. And in De Respublica, Cicero even quotes Scipio, and he says the following: "Yet I am not satisfied with the foremost and wisest Greeks have left us in their writings about the topic, nor do I venture to set my own opinions above theirs. So, as you will listen, I suggest you think of me not as wholly ignorant of Greek views, nor as ranking them above our own, especially in this field. Think of me, rather,
as one of the toga-wearing people who have been given a liberal education thanks to his father's kindly concern, and has been fired from boyhood with a love of learning, but who has nevertheless been trained by experience and family sayings much more than by books." End quote. And so you can see and you can understand, even from the mouthpiece or from one of these leading aristocrats who had exposure to Greek thoughts, who were conversant in the Greek language, they still had a very much self-esteem and self-understanding that was different. And this dynamic plays out differently. And to recur back to the original point that I was trying to make about the ideal, is that the ideal is something in which I like to explain people what an ideal is. An ideal is the dreams that the body politic collectively dreams of together and are enraptured, and they give aesthetic expression to this via their religious, philosophical, and cultural outputs. And Nietzsche talks about how the composing originative mission of any one people is one core mission. So for instance, the Greeks, as I keep on saying, is to excel all others, to be supreme. Whereas, in my opinion, and this is not Nietzsche's words, I extrapolate from this, and I would suppose that for Romans, it's to conquer the world. And you see this in Virgil, right, the Aeneid, and you see this in Ovid, and all this kind of stuff. And this is how I extract and I formulate Romans in my mind, to dominate the world, to dominate themselves, their kind of baser impulses, and to just be simply master. And so much of this, as you can see, the toga-wearing people, but remember, the toga is a symbol of power, potestas, and being able to command clients, to command the world as your client, to command your body as a willing and obedient client, if that makes sense. And so much of Roman history becomes this, and especially later, even though people think that it's a complete rupture, it's in part a rupture, yes, but the Christian Platonic Church of Peter specifically is so much, let's say, a synthesis of this organic development. And finally, of course, the aristocracy. And what is the aristocracy? Is simply the best of those who, over time, become this ideal, right? Who best from the body politic have been leavened over the course of time, and who most closely align with and emulate the ideals which the body politic dreams of, okay? And so this is so important because so few of us, especially because of the Enlightenment, have become intellectually and spiritually impoverished due to the idea of equality, right? And therefore, we're just one big petri dish living on a mass. Or worse, we're individuals, which is completely false. I mean, on a natural basis, humans are a social animal. You're able to take a psychopath, someone ostensibly with antisocial personality disorder, whatever you want to call it, and if you put him in isolation, an isolation unit, or even just someone that's on the frontier by themselves back in the olden days where they had no human contact whatsoever, you'd see so many of them go crazy. And that's because humans are fundamentally individuated parts of a whole. They're not individuals, and they're also not part of the blob, right? So you're not a liberal, and you're most certainly not a communist. We are the synthesis of the two. Man does not lose his nationality or his self simply because he has physically been displaced and is present in another national setting. Conversely, man is not an atomic being, nor is he a Borg mind out of Star Trek. Very important for you to understand. Therefore, if we take this summary understanding of what a state is, or rather what a nation is, in our own parlance, then we start to understand why it is that Caesar had a legitimate claim, right? Because it wasn't simply him grabbing power. It wasn't simply him tyrannically imposing his will on the Republic. There was this
let's say, foundation, subsol kind of situation where the people very much the body politic and himself part of the aristocracy, and therefore the dreams, or so to speak, the ideal of the Roman Republic was very much set against this ossified and tyrannical, rapacious Optimates class. And the only way in political science, or just in that kind of circumstance, to retain power is to constantly repress any kind of resurgent revolution or revolutionary kind of animus. And you see this in modern day within, for instance, as an example, as a counterpoint to what Caesar was. So this is not Caesar, but for instance, the various dictators of the Middle East, they were largely not popular. And so they had to incorporate a large security state, so like the Soviet Union, to be able to impose power from above, as opposed to being in tandem with what the wants and needs of the people were. And sometimes, though, just to give kind of maybe a more positive light to this, sometimes it's important to actually instill discipline, especially if you're trying to live in a country. If your country naturally, spiritually is a weak, underdeveloped, not so great place, sometimes it's necessary for an aristocratic class to impose itself upon, the detritus of what the nation is, to get them from where they are to where they should be, just like that exists in the military, for instance, top-down type discipline. However, I just wanted to emphasize the point that when you're in that circumstance, this is what gives rise to the need for military and political intervention, much in the same vein as the Optimate class in the Roman Republic. Now, to return to the situation at hand, remember that Caesar is beyond the Rubicon, right? He is stationed with 2 legions in the north of Italy, and ultimately he's hearing a bunch of things go down south of the border, so to speak. And effectively what's happening is lawfare, right? The illicit capture of state organs for the partisan interests of a very radical few. And it's not just me saying that. This is Caesar himself relaying this information, right? And this is what the context of raising armies, of intimidating the opposition, of effectively bribing people and eliciting partisan actions that overcome the norms and legal procedures that would otherwise legitimize any kind of official censure. Because remember, before this episode, there's this one episode of time in Roman history where the conspiracy of Catiline, where Catiline was this guy that wanted to do a coup d'etat. He was found out in the conspiracy. Cicero managed to actually, through the proper channels, condemn him to execution successfully, even though there were a sizable faction that sympathized with the conspirator, that ultimately that is a legitimate execution and prosecution of a kind of internal enemy. But, however, what was happening is basically the customs were being trampled over. Everything was being roughshod, pushed through, stamped through, and it was illegitimate in everyone's view. Not simply the Optimates. They themselves actually, you read a lot of the reflections of Cicero and other books. I'm not going to bother you with this, but Cicero was part of this Optimate faction, and he felt that the cause of the Optimates in the Republic were undermined by the conduct of the senators trying to prosecute Caesar, and ultimately it served as a catalyst for his legitimate taking of power, of assumption of dictatorial powers in a state of emergency. And remember, in Rome, the dictatorship was actually a legitimate office, okay? So Cincinnatus is this mythological example, but remember that the dictator is an office enshrined by, both Roman culture,
Roman political culture and in the Constitution itself. It has extraordinary command in a time of crisis. I've written an article about the life of Fabius, which is one of the famous Roman generals who took dictatorial powers to be able to counter the basically life threat that Hannibal posed during the Second Punic War. And this is where we get the Fabian strategy, but I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, zooming back to the time, and we finally see that, okay, Caesar's perceiving what's happening, and ultimately he has two choices. One choice is to surrender himself to the Senate, to give in to their expectations and their demands, and to throw himself at the mercy of his enemies, who, by the way, are hell-bent on having him executed in the same way that Catiline was. So that's a non-starter. In addition to that, remember that Roman law, the individual is the head of the household, and he as the head of the household would have been a representative, right? But what would happen is if he were executed, his property would have been dispersed and basically appropriated by the state, and so he would have left his whole family and his whole string of clients penniless, without power. So it was a non-starter. And therefore what he decided to do, he was like, okay, he went to the legions at his command, especially the 13th, if you watch Rome BBC, and this is where he goes and makes that famous claim, that famous articulation of his place, and it's kind of like a thumb to the pulse of where his legions lay. Because remember, even though technically speaking legionaries and soldiers in general are supposed to basically be obedient to their officers, they're all very political. There are some people that would have abandoned Caesar had it been the case that they felt he wasn't worthy of fighting for. Lepidus famously had the situation happen where during the second triumvirate between Mark Antony, Augustus Caesar, and Lepidus himself, he made a first move to try and invade into Sicily, and his men had no faith in his command and loved Augustus Caesar that much more that in the middle of the night they all marched over to the enemy camp that was camped, just on the other side of the valley, and the next morning he was without an army. So this is still very much a real situation. And if you're able to actually go back to the idea that this still has allusions to modern military command, people think that military command is just like a video game where you could just tell a unit to do something absolutely suicidal or kind of difficult, or kind of act like they're automatons. That is not how humans react. And the art of the commander is being able to understand where your men are mentally, morally, and physically, so strength-wise, health-wise, etc., and be able to weigh that in the calculus of the military paradigm. And so anyway, he makes this famous speech, and I'll quote it to you right now. And this is Caesar, by the way. When Caesar was informed of these events, he called of an assembly of his soldiers. Oh, and by the way, the events he's referencing is that quote I had read earlier, which is about the Senate dismissing the Caesarian faction, intimidating. This is where Mark Antony gets beat up. I'll go back to the quote now. He went over the wrongs his enemies had inflicted on him throughout the past. It was they, he complained, who had estranged Pompey from him, and corrupted his mind when they incited in him envy and belittled Caesar's glory, although he, Caesar, had always promoted and supported Pompey's honor and dignitas. Caesar lamented the new precedent that had been introduced into politics, namely the veto of the tribunes was censured and repressed by force of arms. Sulla, while stripping the tribunes of all their powers, had nonetheless left them free to exercise their veto. Pompey had, by contrast, who had a reputation of having restored all their rights that had been lost, had now actually taken away even those they had retained before. End quote. And so there's a couple things to unpack here, and I want to give you some background. First of all, Roman society is a very manly society in the sense that they still had this monarchical instinct principle. And part of Roman propaganda, quote unquote, for lack of a better word,
was that during the first triumvirate, which was between Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey, it wasn't simply that they were expected to get along. They were expected to be personal friends, brothers, in fact. And in fact, Caesar had married his daughter, Julia, to Pompey. And before this time, Julia had died in childbirth. And so the same thing was reciprocal. There's personal family connections that were being made, and an alliance of blood that is very familiar to you if you're enthusiast of monarchical, medieval alliances brought on by brides and so on. And this is true for archaic and antiquated man. It's still true today, by the way, because family is stronger than ideal. Blood is not in the sense that blood is thicker than water, because in the Christian sense that means the full term is the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb, but we believe in the water of the womb rather than the blood of the covenant, because ultimately it is your boys that you care for the most, and when that is severed, what happens is your personal ties are severed, and so the friend-enemy distinction there, right, Carl Schmitt, what ends up happening is one turns from friend to possible foe. And then second of all, we talk about the Roman Revolution, right? So before Caesar's time, there was this idea that the tribunate, in addition to, so just to give you a background, the Senate was staffed primarily by only patricians, so the aristocracy. They're the ones that legislated, they're the ones that held high office. However, to balance this constitution, to balance the interests of the aristocracy, the tribunes, who were elected directly by the people, would represent and sit in on senatorial legislation. And should it be the case that the Senate is trying to put forward a piece of legislation that is inimical to the interests of the people, what ends up happening is they can exercise tribunate veto. Sulla, and this is part of what happened or what resulted in the Marian crisis, and Sulla took to arms precisely against this Populares faction, and of course the Populares, how do you say this? Their interests were represented through the tribunes of the Senate. They didn't have that many aristocrats on their side. And so when Sulla finally vanquished and destroyed Marius, he actually abridged their powers and left them with the power of the veto, but much diminished. So before it was the case that if out of a body, I think it was 12 or 13 tribunes, if any one of them raised a veto, the entire legislation piece would have been forgone. Now, under Sulla, the veto of the tribunate had to be unanimous, so all tribunes of the people had to veto legislation for it to actually stop in the legislation. And after his death, much of their tribunate powers were accreted, so they increased back to their original potential before Sulla, right? So this is a statement of fact here that conservatism always loses because it doesn't react to political situations as they are. They try to bring it back to a status quo ante, which clearly is not functional, right? This is what brings on crises, right? And so this is what he's talking about in reference to the tribunate of the people. And this is something that the rank and file of the legions would be very much interested in, to have their interests represented on the Senate floor, to be protected against the rapacity and overreach of the aristocracy. And so Pompey originally was a man of the people and of the aristocracy, but because of their lines were cut, Pompey only had the opportunity to actually continue pursuing his course of power by aligning himself with the Optimates, that is, to be against the Populares. And this is where we get this state of friction. And of course, upon hearing this, the 13th raises their gladiuses straight to the sky, and they scream, Mars exulti, which means Mars exalted or exalts. And so what happens is he understands what they want, or Caesar wants. They understand the circumstances, the personal issues that are happening on their behalf, and that Caesar is representing their interests. And in addition to everything else, their acclaim, their, I guess, popular acclaim, which is something very common in archaic man, is just by sheer volume of support, necessarily connotes the affirmation of a commander's proposition. You see this in Sparta, for instance, when the homoioi, which are the peers, were legislating the Gerousia in Sparta. The way that they took votes is by, there would be an assembly of men with spears and shields, literally, and so the way that you'd pass legislation is by measure of volume that you could hear. And it was only in the case that it was where the vote was so close in terms of auditory, I guess, let's say magnitude, that they would ultimately choose to take a I guess what we'd consider a traditional vote in the terms of a ballot. So with this, the legions are marshaled forward. They bring their best, their hearts are ablaze, their gear is spotless, their arms, their sword arms are trained, and their confidence in the commander is reinforced and invigorated. And this is why, by the way, as leaders, it's important for you to elucidate why. If Caesar had approached the 13th and told them, okay, just commanded them, get ready, we're marching on Rome, it would have likely been the case that many of them would be weary, because that is something that's a very distinct difficulty to if you don't know what's going on and you're getting told, hey, we're marching on Rome, you don't know if that's legitimate, especially because that is something that would be an extraordinary measure. And so this is why it's important, and this is what Field Marshal Montgomery from World War II explained, that it's important to make your subordinates understand their part in the larger whole, and to explain what is called the commander's intent. You have to explain the why. This applies to leadership across the board, whether you're in a business or elsewhere. You have to explain why, and if you're not able to proffer a legitimate reason and make that reason well understood, and if you're not able to galvanize people to that why, then of course it's the case that you should probably rethink, readjust, reassess, because remember, you are not in charge of automatons. You're in charge of thinking beings, and as Xenophon said, willing obedience is far better than compelled obedience. And so the 13th are marshaled to arms, they set on a forced march, and they cross the Rubicon. This is what Beethoven said, I will seize fate by the throat. And that's all I have for you today. This is Caesar Imperator with Sergeant Barnes and myself, General Lance, signing off.